Now, the rest of the story. Michael looked down at his basketball jersey. It was drenched with blood. All around him were the shocked expressions of teammates and opposing players. What had happened in those initial eternal moments, Michael wasn't sure. Then, like a hammer crashing on an anvil, the pain struck. The 16-year young basketball team captain reeled into the arms of a nearby forward and was helped from the court. A doctor was on the sidelines to confirm the now obvious. Michael, having collided with an opponent jaw first, had bitten off his own tongue. This is the rest of the story. From the beginning, Michael Phillip was everything that a gung-ho physical education instructor could expect of a son. Throughout his childhood, he was a hyperactive blur, climbing trees and fences and throwing and catching balls and never sitting when he could walk and never walking when he could run. There were the predictably consequential injuries, like the time he fell 2 stories out of a pine tree he was scaling, or the time he was vaulting from one backyard to another and impaled his hand on an iron fence spike. But such minor calamities never stopped Michael. By the age of 12, he was teaching physical education at a local army base to the children of personnel there. Michael adapted well to military-style regimentation. In school, he entered officers' training, wherein he marched and drilled with an enthusiasm that overwhelmed his superiors. In his spare time, Michael sang with a little group called the Blue Boys. That is, until that painful collision on the basketball court when he bit off and unwittingly swallowed the tip of his tongue. Afterward, Michael would not even attempt to speak, and for many days he suffered in silence. His buddies in the group visited during his convalescence. "I suppose your singing days are over," one of them said sadly, and Michael nodded. Nobody had imagined the frightening extent to which his injury had altered his voice forever. And not just his enunciation, but his entire voice. For weeks later, when next the Blue Boys met to rehearse, Michael did try to sing, but the crisp, refined intonation the others had known so well was gone, and in its place was the weirdest, the grittiest sound that any of them had ever heard. Good thing Michael was athletically inclined, the others agreed, because no way would he be able now to allow people to hear what his friends had just heard. But how very wrong they were. For once upon an ordinary high school basketball game, an ordinary teenage jock literally swallowed his own tongue and sealed his future from that day to this. That was many million sellers and many millions of dollars ago. You see, the polite, articulate tongue Michael was born with might have been anyone's. Yet what was left behind when it departed is, one of a kind. A hard-edged vocal style that forged a rock and roll institution. A brash, brassy presentation that formed the cornerstone of the Rolling Stones. Of course you know the teenage athlete who injured himself, rich and famous, as Michael Phillip Jagger. Mick Jagger. Only now you know the rest of the story.
And now, the rest of the story. Sir Michael Phillip Jagger, better known as Mick Jagger, was born on July 26, 1943 in Dartford, England. That's about 18 miles southeast of London. Mick said, "I always sang as a child. I was one of those kids who just liked to sing. Some kids sing in choirs, others like to show off in front of the mirror. I was in the church choir, and I also loved listening to singers on the radio, the BBC or Radio Luxembourg, or watching them on TV and in the movies." In September 1950, Mick first met Keith Richards when they were classmates at Wentworth Primary School in Dartford. In 1954, the Jaggers moved to Wilmington, and Mick and Keith lost contact with each other. Mick and Keith were about 11 years old at that time. Within a couple of years of the move, Mick formed his first garage band. And on October 17, 1961, Mick, with Chuck Berry and Muddy Waters records under his arm, saw Keith again as they waited for a train on platform number 2 of Dartford Railway Station. Their conversation focused on Mick's records as well as other rhythm and blues artists. Mick, Keith, and friends Dick Taylor, Alan Etherington, and Bob Beckwith formed a group called the Blues Boys. Mick and Keith moved into an apartment with Brian Jones shortly thereafter. Keith and Brian made plans to form another band, but Mick continued studying finance and accounting. That's hard to imagine. Sharing an apartment with two guitarists, Mick couldn't resist singing, and they played in a band called Blues Incorporated. When Blues Incorporated were not playing, Mick, Keith, and Brian borrowed their gear and performed at a basement club called Ferry's Club. On July 12, 1962, they played a show at a London jazz club called the Marquee Club. Now, this gig is significant because it was the first time they ever played under their familiar name, the Rolling Stones. They chose that name after one of their favorite Muddy Waters songs, Rolling Stone. Now, their songs are easily identifiable, largely because of Mick Jagger's voice. The story of Mick Jagger's voice and accent change after biting off the tip of his tongue had become an accepted fact. Well, until the last 10 years or so. The last newspaper article I could find which mentioned this was published in a newspaper called The Irish Independent in August of 2012. These days, most reporters don't even mention the tongue-biting incident. So can biting the tip of your tongue off change your accent? Can it make your voice go from smooth to gravelly? According to Dr. Marshall Chasin, who has been a clinical and research audiologist for more than 40 years, who is also the Director of Research and the Chief Audiologist for the Musicians Clinics of Canada, the first clinic of its kind in North America to serve performing artists, the answer is that it sure makes a good story. The story goes that when Mick was 16, he was playing a sport. Some say basketball, some reporters have said it was soccer, and others say it was a gymnastic event when he bit off the tip of his tongue. Mick purportedly couldn't speak well for the first week, but when he did, his posh London accent was gone, and he now spoke in a completely different Cockney-like slang accent. His voice was no longer smooth, but had a gravelly and bluesy sound. In a report published in 2015, Dr. Chasin said, "I'm skeptical that he bit off that much, and even more skeptical that his speech patterns had changed all that much, but it does make for a good story. There is a growing body of research on people who intentionally have their tongues altered surgically to get a forked tongue. This dramatic cutting appears to have no effect on their speech patterns or gravel sound of their voices. The change in vocal cord state results in certain sound qualities, such as a gravelly voice and a breathy voice or a husky voice. That is, changes in voice sound qualities are the result of changes in the mechanics of the vocal cords and have little to do with the articulation of the tip of the tongue against the roof of the mouth or against the teeth. There is nothing in speech sciences that tongue damage would have created more gravelly or bluesy voice." For Mick Jagger to have a more gravelly or bluesy voice after the tongue-biting accident, he would have had to have encountered some other accident that damaged his vocal cords. Now, the earliest mention that I could find of Mick Jagger biting off the tip of his tongue was published in the Houston Chronicle on April the 27th, 1969. In this three-sentence story, it reported that Mick Jagger attributes his different singing style to his having bitten off the tip of his tongue. Now let's take a look at Mick Jagger's tongue. Now there's a sentence I never imagined myself saying. Anyway, if we take a look at photos of Mick Jagger's tongue, there's no evidence of him having bitten the tip of it off. So where do these stories come from? Well, a lot of times these stories come from the artists themselves. This story purportedly came from Mick's own publicist. Now let me tell you another story about a member of the Rolling Stones, Keith Richards. In early 1973, the Rolling Stones were preparing for a world tour, but Keith was addicted to heroin. Keith searched for a way to end his habit. Following a hospital visit in Switzerland, a journalist asked him how he got himself clean from drugs. He told that journalist that he'd gone to Switzerland and had his blood completely changed, just as you would have the oil changed in your car. He opened his jacket and said, "How do you like my blood change?" From there, the story spread like wildfire. For more than 3 decades, newspapers, magazines, and biographies all relayed the complete blood change story as fact. I've heard it many times in casual conversation myself. Yes, I'm a Stones fan. In his memoir, Life, Keith admitted that he was just fooling around. That's all it was, a joke. I was sick of answering that question, so I gave them a story. Very good book, by the way. Keith has admitted that many parts of his public image were fabrications to build mystique, but it appears that there is a grain of truth to the story. Keith had a treatment called hemodialysis, a treatment that removes waste and extra fluids from the blood and regulates blood pressure. It's kind of like having an inline fuel filter on your lawnmower. It filters out contaminants. Keith has gone to some effort to debunk the total blood transfusion story. It seems that although newspapers, magazines, and biographies have said that Mick Jagger's sound was due to his biting off the tip of his tongue, well, that was just another fabrication to build mystique. It gives people something to talk about. Stories such as Keith's total blood transfusion and Mick's tongue-biting incident helped to make the Rolling Stones one of the most famous bands in history. Do you have a favorite Rolling Stones song? Well, for me, there are just too many to choose from. It's like choosing your favorite child. I'm Brad Dison. Thanks for watching. And now you know the rest of the story.